All right, let's pick back up where we left off on Thursday. I know we've had this snow day. Let everyone kind of enjoy that, but we're off today, and I want to try and make sure that we stay on track and get enough of the information at least delivered so that we're not behind. So if you remember from Thursday, we kind of left off talking about which parts of these, which of these components of sustainability are most important to you, and each person had their own thing that was important to them, and we got to see that, and that's important. And so that's where you'll be focusing your priorities for that sustainability. All of these together are going to bring us into the future. So now just a little bit about some agronomic crops. Agronomy, for me, when I think about agronomy, I think about the term autonomy, because agronomists are basically going to be like a one man or one woman show. They're going to be the ones that are responsible for everything from the seed going into the ground to the fertilizer management plan to being able to meet with producers, from having to learn the new technology so that they can bring that information to those producers. It's just you are going to be in charge of your own little operation, and for all of the people that are within your little territory, or under your management. And so this takes into all basically everything that we've done up until this point with soils, with plant science. If you've had me for fertility, all of those things all really come into that. And so for this particular course, as I mentioned, it's Agronomy 101, and we're going to combine all of the components of that so that you get to see everything that goes into how to be an agronomist. So kind of understanding, just going to go back over a little bit about plant science and understand why crops grow, where they grow. Obviously, we're going to have some impact of climate. Some crops were grown in one location, let's say in Southeast Asia, and then we decided that we would like to grow those crops here in the United States, or maybe in South America, or wherever. But having an understanding of where that crop was originated allows us to cultivate that crop and allow production in a different environment that wasn't what it was originally intended for. And so, just to look at some of the different crops and where they came from, it seems that in North America we don't have a whole lot of original crops. So we've imported a lot of these other food staples into our culture so that we can survive. Some of the common field crops, particularly one that is going to be important to our future, are going to be cereal grain crops, and so we're talking things like corn and wheat. Those are going to be the two big ones. Rice is a cereal grain, and so those are like three staples of a common diet where we're going to get our carbs from, our starches. So we've got legumes and forages, roots and fiber crops, and then also fruits and vegetables. The fibers, kind of what we grow for clothing and whatnot. So we're talking like cotton or jute, or maybe even bamboo, things of that nature. So just to understand that these all came from a different location. We are trying to grow them here in America so that we can increase our gross domestic product, so that we have a economic society that allows us to not only feed our people but also to export that to other countries that maybe not be able to grow those crops. And so cereals are grasses that are grown for edible seed. And so we can see a look at some of the cereals that we're talking about. We've got wheat, oat, and rice, corn. These are ones we're probably most familiar with. Sorghum is something that I know that Dr. Bear uh, likes to grow. We've got millets and barley and rye. These are probably not more like as far as staples go, as far as like what we would eat, but I know that like barley might be for some sort of like a beer or other components. But I'm not really like going to the store to buy barley, and rye might be for like bread or something. So just to understand that when we talk about cereals, we're talking about these types of crops and that they're grasses, right? So they're mostly going to be monocots. We're going to grow legumes for seed. And so these might be, you might hear these as pulses. And so just to look at some of the different types of legumes, one thing about legumes is that they are likely to fix atmospheric nitrogen. So these crops are really good to grow, not only because we don't have to apply fertilizer, they provide us some semblance of fats and proteins. So for instance, soybean is going to have a large uh, protein value, and then also some fats like peanuts, right? So also that we can grow these crops, and when they fix that atmospheric nitrogen after we harvest them, those residues go back into the soil, and they can add some nutrient back to that. So um, especially like soybean, or if we're growing some sort of cover crop, legumes are going to add some nitrogen back to the soil. Our forage crops, these are going to be what we use to feed our animals. And then when we feed those animals, hopefully that eventually we would be taking those to sell those that are going to be created into meat products of various sorts, right? So that's why those forage crops are important to us. Now, humans aren't out there eating orchard grass, but we might consume some of uh, the animals that we are growing and feeding hay to. Root crops, these are going to be like our beets and turnips, carrots, things of that nature, sweet potatoes and yams. These are crops that are the bulk of what we're going to eat are actually underground. They serve as the root. And just something to think about, I never really knew the difference between sweet potatoes and yams, but there is a difference. So, when you're thinking about food at, you know, I don't know, Thanksgiving or Christmas, it was always past the yams, but they were really sweet potatoes. So, just something to think about there, that we have there is a difference between sweet potatoes and yams. We have our fiber crops, as I mentioned, cotton, flax. There's this push for hemp, canaf, or maybe sun hemp that are going to be made into rope. While we are not necessarily doing that in large quantities here at Tennessee Tech, there are universities that are trying to push for the research in those things. And one thing about hemp is that it can grow in very difficult conditions. So you don't need to have very good land in order to grow this. It is highly adaptable, and so that is one way of on our marginal lands that we can grow some crop that is going to provide us some economic return. Fruits and vegetables. It was always this cool thing about fruits and vegetables that we don't necessarily think that tomato being a fruit, but it is. And there's an old saying that knowledge is knowing that tomato is a fruit, wisdom is knowing not to put it in fruit salad, and philosophy is wondering if ketchup is a smoothie. So the thing that separates fruits from vegetable crops are going to be the seeds, right? So the seeds being grown inside or on the outside of these different uh, fruit. I know we got bell pepper over here, and I feel like they just kind of got put in there. Cucumber as well has seeds in it. Chilies, but for the most part, these are the two categories that we're looking for when we're growing fruits and vegetables. We have some warm season and some cool season, such as like broccoli or cabbage. And next we have cover crops. And so if you had me for soils last semester, we kind of left out talking about the cover crops. And as we move into sustainability, I want to incorporate that into our kind of lesson plan so that students have a better understanding of the cover crops and how they can be used in order to add back organic matter and to make sure that our nutrient management is sustainable so that we can grow these cover crops over the winter. They will retain some of the nutrients and some of the moisture, And when they are terminated in the spring, or I guess for us it would be late spring, they'll add some of those nutrients back to the soil, and that our cash crop can actually take up some of those nutrients. Most of these, but not all of them, are going to be uh, legumes such as our clover and our hairy vetch, and they're going to add back some plant available nitrogen. And we'll go over that later on. Um, I think that's in like module 2. I think that's going to be the end of module 2, where we talk about these different cover crops. All right, so everyone is aware that we are on this kind of produce more with less, and that we are going to need to increase our productivity by some 70% greater than what we are currently doing. And we have this struggle between, we don't want to apply more fertilizer, we want to minimize our pesticide use, and we want to increase water efficiency, and all these things. And so traditionally breeding techniques were used, but now that as we start to make scientific advancements, we're going to start including the use of genetically modified or genetically engineered organisms. Um, I understand that some students might have an aversion to that, and that's fine. But to say that we're going to stop using GE or GMOs is probably not going to happen, because we are trying to increase our productivity. So we'll have a little bit of understanding about some of those GMOs and just some of the other cool things, um, near like module 3 when we go over that. I think it's important to understand crop physiology. And so the latter portion of this module is going to be on that crop physiology. So we're going to go back over photosynthesis and the light and the dark reactions and C3 and C4 and CAM to understand that. And to kind of set that up, as I was looking on my Twitter, it's now called X. One of the certified crop advisors that happened to pop up had a their blurb, or their post, was about that as agronomists and as crop producers, we're actually harvesting that sunlight. We are adding the other stuff, we are adding the water and the nutrients in order to enhance the efficiency of capturing and harvesting that sunlight and converting that into energy for the plant. So this kind of made me think a little bit something different that I was not used to, but that is actually the most important part. And so if you can remember from soils and soil fertility, we had Liebig's law of the minimum. And so we had that barrel and that had all those different staves on it. And if we don't have sunlight, well, then we don't perform photosynthesis. And so if we don't perform photosynthesis, then none of those other things are really that important. So just something to think about, that as we move forward, that our goal as crop producers, whether it be agronomic crops, or whether it be horticultural crops or landscape or whatever it is, we are trying to harvest and maximize the efficiency of that sunlight that we harvest into energy production, so that we can either grow crops more efficiently, that we're going to harvest and eat as humans, or that we're going to grow for forages and hay that we're going to feed to animals that end up bringing us some economic value. And then ultimately, that this is going to involve plant breeders. We're going to need some geneticists. We're going to need fertility and engineers. And it's really going to be a very collaborative future. And for me, what I'm thinking about is like being able to use smart farm technologies and figure out how we can maximize this. So not only this is going to include these people, but also computer scientists, as we start to use artificial intelligence and machine learning towards meeting this future need for productivity. I mean, we're going to have some problems with diseases and insect control, because as the climate starts to evolve or change, or whatever, that's going to influence our disease and pest cycles. And so we're going to need to be able to stay on top of that and figure out ways that we can mitigate that before we get into this problem. Something else we're going to look at is going to be, or that you'll at least experience as you grow, like in your careers, is going to be like protein quality. and then also nutrient density. And so what we want is if we can grow more dense, nutrient dense crops that have more protein or that have more starches or that have more fats where we get our nutrients from, so being fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, then we would need to consume less like food material. So if there was more protein in a certain crop product, we would not need to consume as much of it. So if we needed, I don't know, 150 grams of protein per day, and this crop product that we have provides us with, 40 grams of protein for each time that we eat it, then we would only need a very small portion in order to meet that nutritional need. And I really have a feeling that they are going to start, they being the government or the powers that be that determine how we should live our lives, are going to start rationing out these foods based on nutrient density, not like volume or quantity. While we, do think about this as being, climate change and we're going to have this global warming, we are also experiencing some changes in the winter months as well. So we want to increase the winter hardiness of some of these more warm season crops so that we can extend that crop production. This is especially important for those who raise cattle and going into animal sciences, that we want to make sure that our crops do not suffer greatly from that extreme cold so that the animals can still have something to graze and eat as they move into those winter months. And if we can extend grazing periods, then we minimize the amount of hay that we need to feed. And that also has a lot of implications that go into animal production. And then drought and heat tolerance as we start to have long periods without rainfall. But then what happens when we do get that rainfall? We get a lot of it at once, don't we? We get like 2 inches in 2 days. So uh, the temperature is going to change, and that's going to have an impact uh, plant plant physiology. We'll discuss a little bit about that environmental physiology. I took a class, uh, environmental crop physiology, when I was in grad school. It was pretty interesting to think about how all of the different factors of climate actually impact crop growth and yield. And so, while we won't get into like crop modeling, there are some classes that do focus on crop modeling. But it was pretty interesting to think about that, how when clouds come over, that changes how much light the plant can actually receive and then convert into energy. And then each one of those components has an impact. All right, so I want to get back to a little bit about the classification and botany to kind of bring everybody back together, just a little bit of a touch back from plant science. Okay, so we have two different classes of plants. We have those that don't make seeds, and then we have those that do make seeds. So for us, we are looking for, on this far side of this graph, we are looking for those angiosperms that produce a flower that provide a seed, because we are either going to use the seed for food, and we're also going to use that seed as we are going to replant that. So that's important for us. So this is going to be the area that we are mostly going to focus on when we're talking about crop production. As I mentioned, we're going to use that seed to carry on the reproduction, and some of the crops that fall into that are going to be monocots and dicots. And so remember that monocots as one cotyledon, so one leaf that comes out, and those are going to be our grasses and our cereals. Remember that these are going to be very important for us. These are our corns, our wheats, our rye, and rice. So these are going to be staple crops where we get our carbohydrates from. And then our dicots or dicotyledons are going to be our legumes and our vegetables and flowers as well. So just a look at the differences between monocots and dicots, and having an understanding of those is going to influence how we produce these crops. So for our monocots, we are going to have this very long leaf There's going to have parallel veination. So if you think about a corn leaf, that is going to be very long, and all those veins run kind of, perpendicular to the main vein. In our dicots, we have more of a palm shape. And so we are going to have each one of these veins that are going to transport nutrients and water up the xylem into the different components and areas of the plants. Another thing is going to be the root system. And so if we have a very fibrous root system, we would want to use those. Those crops are likely to hold our soil in place better. Whereas dicots typically have a taproot that goes further down into the soil that is going to mine more of that, the lower depths of that soil in those horizons in order to get their water. So if you think about it, the fibrous root system is likely to need more irrigation, and also it will be able to only scavenge on the very top of the soil, whereas our taproot might be able to dig down and mine more of that water or those nutrients that might have leached or kind of infiltrated into the soil. Actually, they will percolate through the soil. And then we have our flower parts. And so we'll get into flower parts a little bit later. So we had this binomial nomenclature. And, for the most part for this class, we are going to mostly just focus on the genus and the species. And I feel like, it's probably not very often that in your field that you will use a lot of scientific nomenclature. But I do feel that if you do not know that scientific nomenclature, then my generation, or those scientists that came prior to us, they did have to know that nomenclature. And so if you don't know it, they might look down on you. They look down on you, then they're looking down on Tennessee Tech. So just to be aware that Zea mays is corn, or corn plant. The cotton is Gossypium hirsutum, and there are different species of cotton. So we have upland cotton. Cotton actually has a very, there is a graphic that shows how all of the different crosses of cotton came to be. And so there are several species of cotton that we have crossed in order to get what we currently have today. Soybean is going to be glycine max. All right, so for our families, grasses are going to come from the Poaceae family. And these are going to be our cereal crops and about 75% of our forage crops. And so grasses grow much differently than legumes, obviously. They're going to grow very tall, and they have a very cylindrical kind of stem with nodes and internodes that allow that to move up. Another thing about grass is that they grow from the inside out. So kind of like our fingernails grow, right? They grow from the bottom up. This is actually like the growth point of our fingernails, and this will also be the growth point of the grass as well. So it will grow from the center out, and it will move out and put those leaves out together. They have a fibrous root system, so they are going to, we want our grasses to kind of hold that soil into place, and so they might only grow, 6 inches down. The leaves are alternate with parallel veins, and our flowers are usually perfect. Perfect meaning that they have both male and female parts. Next, for our legume, they are from the Fabaceae family, and they have a taproot with alternate netted veination, and not so much to get into the flowers, but we do want to notice that they have different flower heads, or flower types. So we have racemes and heads and spike-like Not so much that we're going to get into that, but just to understand that there are different flower types, not a similar. There are two growth stages to most of our crops that we're going to grow. We have a vegetative stage, and then we have a reproductive stage. And so when we get into our crops, we will look and see that we have these vegetative. VE stands for vegetative emergence. So this is when that first cotyledon comes out. And then as we have more leaves, true leaves that form, we'll look and see there is a collar here. And when that leaf comes out and makes that collar, I should probably do it this way. When that leaf comes out and makes that collar, that is where we consider that V1 or V2 or V4 or V6. And so because we know these different vegetative growth stages, we can start to determine when we are going to apply fertilizer or when they need water, when we can expect to have our, the transition between vegetative and reproductive, which for corn, this is going to be at VT, which means vegetative tassel. And once we have this stage, we are now have the male part of the flower. And actually, the female part of the flower is going to be the corn ear leaf. And so there will be a little corn ear that is in there, and the silks are actually part of the female flower, and that is where the pollen from the tassel falls onto that female part of that flower that then begins to grow the ear of corn. And so for our reproductive stage, for each of the different crops, there are different reproductive stages, and there are different requirements for those each of those different crops. Like for instance, soybean need a fair amount of irrigation once they reach reproductive stage, and I guess so does corn. But at some point in time, we want that irrigation to stop so that we can, once we reach physiological maturity, we're going to need those we're going to need less water so that we can start to dry down those crops. For corn, it's about 15.5% moisture. Next, we have life cycles. And so annuals are going to create their life cycle in one growing season. Biennials are going to do it in two growing seasons. And perennials actually remain alive indefinitely. And so one of the crops that we typically don't think of as being a perennial is cotton. Cotton is a perennial that we grow as an annual. Cotton will continue to grow. One of the things that we do with cotton is apply a plant growth regulator so that we can actually keep that plant the way that we want it, right? So that we can keep it within this certain growth habit, and also that those plant growth regulators allow or kind of force the energy that is being made through photosynthesis to stay in just this little portion of the plant. So that energy is actually very dense there. And so understanding these different life cycles is going to be important for how you grow your crops. So for the most part, for our annuals, and this is important because when we go over, when we do corn, which is going to be one of our main crops that we're going to grow, or rice or wheat. And remember that we're going to grow cotton as an annual as well. Within the first 7 to 10 days of planting, we're going to have emergence. For about 45 days. So here we are, we've emerged, we have germination, we have emergence, and then we are going to have our leaf growth, which is going to be important for harvesting that sunlight. And when we think about this, planting population becomes a very big deal because we want enough plants so that we can grow enough crops and we can have enough yield that makes it worth growing those crops. And then also that we don't want to have those too far together because then we'll have shading, and now we've actually we have overcrowding and we can't harvest that sunlight. So now even though we plant more, we actually grow less. And then we have a reproductive phase, right? So that's going to be the end. It looks like that's going to be about 2 months. And so we'll have flowering, we'll have a pollination phase, and then here we are into our reproductive and finally our fruit and seed maturity. That's going to be about 30 days. So understanding and knowing that it's going to take us, what is this? This is 55, 55 and 65. So about 120 days. So about 4 months worth of crop growth. And that's going to be important because we want to make sure that we're planting or that we at least have enough daylight and climate and temperature. This is kind of the lead in the climate and the temperature in order to facilitate this 120-day life cycle. And so in some instances, we want to have like a 105-day life cycle. So we have bred plants to go through these phases in a shorter period of time so that we can get a crop out earlier. So let's say if you're trying to grow corn in Minnesota, you would have like a 100 to 105-day life cycle of corn or a maturity date. And so this is going to be based on temperature. So as we move into at least the lab, I want to set this up such that when we think about this 120 days, we can actually predict when these crops will meet each one of these different growth stages based on, you might remember this from plant science, growing degree days. And so that's really going to be the determining factor. We need temperature in order to get to these different growth stages. So just keep that in mind that as we move forward, when I talk about climate, we're actually going to be predicting these different growth stages. I'll jump back here just a little. We can actually predict these growth stages based on temperature. And we can get pretty accurate with that as well. And that allows us to plan out our growing season. So having an understanding of your life cycle and how long it takes and when that's supposed to occur, you can kind of sort of backtrack and plan such that you can, let's say you want to harvest in September because you're trying to get to market early. Unfortunately, in Tennessee, I found out from this class that you don't plant corn until May, which is odd for me because we're at V6 by May in Mississippi. We plant in the middle of March, sometimes even early March. So just based on where you are in the country and the temperature and the climate is really going to dictate how much crops you can grow. And then finally, we have senescence, which ends that growing season, and we will start over again later. Some of the crops will be biennials, and so we have this kind of two-stage growth pattern where we'll have our first year of growth that will start at the end of that, we'll initiate the flowering, and after flowering near the second summer, we'll end up with that reproductive growth and we'll harvest our crops, and that will be the end of that. Now, it's important to know that you would want to offset these types of crops so that you can produce something every year. You would not want to plant a biennial in 2024, expecting to harvest a crop in 2024. You wouldn't harvest that crop until 2025. So you would want to offset those if you're going to be growing biennials. You need to make sure that you're offsetting so that you have something to produce and harvest for that particular year. You would not want to wait 2 years to get your return on investment if you were to plant a biennial. Our perennials are going to continue to grow. They'll grow all year long and they'll continue to grow. And as they grow, they'll get bigger. And so understanding a little bit about their growth cycle, when you can expect them to reach certain growth stages, and that might be important for trying to sell them. Excuse me, this being for likely to be in our landscape and our horticulture industry. And so that we'll have these different, we'll either have herbaceous types or we'll have woody types. And so, depending on which one it is that you're trying to grow, having an understanding of that growth cycle and when they're going to develop will allow you to plan on when you need to plant and also when the season is for them to make it to that market. All right, so for the structure and the function, we have three different, or three main components of a crop plant. We have the roots, we have stems and modified stems, and we'll go over those. And then we have the leaves, and their primary function of the leaf is to perform photosynthesis. And so you have to think about that we have this long leaf. Well, let's say it's for a corn plant. And if we have, oh, let me see. All right, I'm going to use this ruler as a corn leaf. And if we have sunlight hitting this corn leaf, how much of this ray actually is absorbed by that plant leaf? Well, we're missing some, aren't we? We're not capturing the full length or the full amount of that sunlight. Well, what about if we have our, let's say, a soybean plant or a cotton plant, and we have the sunlight striking down? Now we are absorbing more of that sunlight. So understanding which one is which will help you kind of determine which crop it is that you want to grow. And that actually goes into planting population. So we would likely plant, I end up saying this wrong because, well, we actually plant soybean at like 75 to 80,000 plants per acre. And we plant corn at like 35 to 40,000 plants. But then again, also, that's going to go into, cover and row spacing. But the primary purpose of that is to absorb that sunlight. And some of those other, we need carbon dioxide and water, and that's going to output glucose and oxygen. So that's going to be kind of the latter end of this module. That's going to be the hardest part, is going in and knowing which one, all the different components of that photosynthesis, because I want to give you an understanding of that crop physiology. All right, so some important root functions. Number one, they're going to give our plants some anchorage and support. Right. So, and you might even see in corn plants, we'll have these support roots that kind of grow out, and they will sit on the soil and kind of give that, they're called bracing roots, so that that plant has some extra brace on the top. Naturally, we're going to absorb some of water and nutrients from the soil. That is going to carry those nutrients up the xylem to the leaves to perform photosynthesis. That glucose will then come back down to the roots. It'll also be distributed throughout the plant, but for the most part, the glucose will move down the phloem to the roots so that they can continue to support the plant. So we have osmosis, where this greater nutrition in the plant will move water from the soil into the plant. So this is trying to kind of form some sort of equilibrium, and that water will move in. So we have, and this can also go in as far as if you have me for fertility, this is also part of diffusion. So osmosis is going to move water from the soil into the plant because there's greater nutrient concentration inside the plant. So we're trying to balance that out. Next, we have plasmolysis. And so this is where we have a greater nutrient concentration in the soil, and the water will actually come out of the plant. So this is if you have ever applied too much fertilizer, or there was a couple of students that were wanting to know something about like hot litter. So if you apply animal manure and it's still what they call hot, it will burn it will burn the crop. And so what that is actually that's water moving from the plant into the soil because there's a greater concentration in the soil and not the plant. And then next, we have dewdrop. And so this is where water uptake actually exceeds transpiration. And so you'll have that little drop of water that is what we call butational water that is actually trying to get out of that leaf. So we're like, we have too much water coming into the plant, and instead of it evaporating like it normally would, we're almost like, if you can think about like a syringe, where you have more water than you are releasing, and there's going to be that little drop that is at the end of that plant. All right. Next, we have stems and modified stems, and these are going to be our nodes and internodes. And we start to move into our stolons and our rhizomes. So stolons are above ground. Stolons move above ground, and as they do, they will put down another set of roots and start to grow another plant. And as that plant starts to grow, it will put out another stolon. And it will put out roots, and it will start to grow another plant. So when we're thinking about stolons, I tend to think of grasses when I'm thinking of stolons, especially Bermuda grass. And so if you've had me for turf management, not sure anyone has, but I teach that in the fall. We'll be going over more about stolons and rhizomes. Rhizomes are underground stems. So if you can think about one that we're probably the most familiar with is Johnson grass. Johnson grass has a rhizome that grows underneath, and it will put up a new shoot, but from underneath the soil. That's why Johnson grass is so hard to kill, because you might spray Roundup on the top of it, but the roots are underneath and they're still growing, and they put out a rhizome, and it'll pop up and then pop up another one. Cattail are very similar as well. And so the thing about rhizomes is that each one of these plants are identical to the mother plant. Next, we have corms. Corms. We have bulbs. So like our tulips. And then tubers. And tubers are going to be like our potatoes. So modified stems are corms, bulbs, and tubers. Right? And the function of these stems is to conduct water and mineral from the soil to the leaves to perform what function? Photosynthesis. Very good. And that occurs up the xylem. So the xylem carries it up, the phloem carries it down. So once the leaf has performed photosynthesis and makes that glucose, then the xylem transports that throughout the plant as well. But for the most part, we're going to get some of that nutrient and some of that glucose back down to the roots, so that they can then grow more, take up more nutrients. They then go back up the xylem, out to the leaves. Leaves perform photosynthesis. It goes back to the stem, down to the roots. Roots grow more, take up more, up. And so there's just this constant recirculation of nutrients and minerals and water and glucose. So understanding that is going to help you know how much crop you actually are growing or are not. So stems are going to support and protect most of those organs. So when we're thinking about the organs, that's xylem and phloem. And they're also going to hold on to or provide some base for the leaves and the flowers to like hold on to, so that we can capture that sunlight. Storage of food materials, and then also they're going to manufacture those carbohydrates and also grow or create that chlorophyll, which are going to be in the leaves, which are part of photosynthesis. So you're starting to see how all of these things really come together for one big purpose, which is to capture that sunlight and create some carbohydrate, fat, or protein via seed. And then finally, the leaves. So the primary function of the leaf is going to be photosynthesis, but also transpiration. And so this is important. And those of you that had me from soils, you remember the big tree picture where we have nutrients and water coming from the soil and going all the way up and out the top of that plant. Well, the transpiration is important for several things. Much like humans, when we get hot, we will sweat. And so that is one way to cool our skin and our body. I'm from Mississippi. We don't get very much of that transpiration and evaporation. So we basically just sweat and it only makes it hotter. But for the plants, that is a way that they can cool themselves off through that transpiration. And then the major components of that plant are going to be the epidermis, so the outer layer. We have the mesophyll cells. This is going to be where photosynthesis. This is also going to be where like the Calvin cycle occurs. We have the vascular bundles, which are our xylem and our phloem. So our vascular bundles, and then the stoma or the stomata. And this is where we have gas exchange. So carbon dioxide will come in through the stoma. It will either be fixed in the mesophyll cells, depending on C3, C4, or CAM. It will perform photosynthesis. Photosynthesis being, we had the light and the dark reactions, and where those happen, that will eventually create glucose that can then be transported throughout the plant. And they just look a little bit different between monocots and dicots. And then finally, the portions of the plant. So we have the leaf blade. Many of us are familiar with what the leaf blade is. We have the petiole. The bud, which will form a new leaf. And that occurs at the node. We have the stem, which is support for the leaf. That's where the leaf grows out of. And in our monocots, we have the sheath. And so this is where this sheath actually protects the leaf as it is growing from inside of that sheath. So this is the protective. This is the auricle and the collar. As I mentioned, once this grows out, this is now collared, and this is now like at B1 or B2, B6, whichever. And we'll be able to see this actually in lab. Previously, I wasn't able to do this because I came from Mississippi, and I was like, you know what? We'll be able to plant crops in March, and we didn't get to plant any crops. So in lab, what we're going to do is we're going to get these plants started so that you can actually see this plant growth. You can actually count V1, V2, V3. No, we won't have 4 months worth of growth. We'll probably have 2 or 3, and we'll be able to see that going into the summer months. All right, so that's going to do it for this particular lecture. This will at least get us caught up. And when we come back on Tuesday, we're going to get into climate. All right. We'll see y'all in a couple of days. Bye.